Professor Outka, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Well, I was very impressed by this recontextualization of course, you know, it's one of the well-known texts, Yeats's poem, through the pandemic lens. Now, and of course, many other things. And now the floor is open for questions. We have about 45 minutes for questions and maybe time allowing comments and some discussion.
And thank you so much, and thank you also to all the folks who are writing in. These are very nice. These are very nice texts.
All right, so maybe as we wait, I thought I was going to have, like, I was going to ask a couple of questions from my notes.
Wonderful.
I was wondering, like, you've been studying these texts from the period, from what you call, or through what you call the pandemic lens, for a while now, obviously. Do you think it's possible to talk about or observe cultural differences in the representations of pandemics or illness in the larger sense from that historical period, or maybe in the more general sense? Have you observed anything of that sort? Like perhaps maybe to narrow it down regarding the descriptions of the bodily symptoms as opposed to the psychological symptoms.
Yeah, you know, there was sort of yes and no in that the flu was somewhat, this particular flu was somewhat remarkable for the sort of, and people remark on this, that the uniformity of the symptoms. I mean, there were many symptoms, but across the globe, the way that it is experienced, you know, the way it was experienced and unfolded was often very similar in different areas. But the cultural representations of those of the illness was there were differences. I think, you know, for example, some of the differences I saw depended on when how involved a particular country was in World War I, and sort of how much attention World War I had taken from it. So, for example, in a place like Nigeria, which was unbelievably hard hit, the representations of the flu are much more direct, and there's even it even entered the culture in that it became a marker of time. So people's ages were gauged by their relationship to when the flu had struck. Right, so we're like really intrinsic to the structure of the. It really entered that sort of the sense of time. In the works that I looked at, I saw a big difference between the American works and the British and Irish works. In that, the American works I looked at were. Treated the flu much more directly, called it by name, and by and large they were later. They were sometimes 1 and 2 decades after that people were sort of ready to process it, and so some of the works I look at, those American works are they're looking directly at symptoms. They're looking directly at the flu outbreak, and this is speculation on my part, but I think some of it was. Because the United States entered the war much later, and so it was possible somehow to talk about the pandemic, whereas in Britain the references to the flu are much more covert, and they emerge sort of at the time of the pandemic, and there were many authors who talked about how it seemed it seemed disloyal to even pay attention to the flu, right? To pay attention to these deaths seemed disloyal to the country, to the war, to the national interest. And so authors often ignored it or sort of put it in a kind of these very stealth, these sort of very stealth ways. There was also a sort of difference between that sort of masculinity, femininity came in here, and that the pandemic was seen as a kind of weak death versus the sacrificial death in the war, and that played into it. So those are just a few examples. There's, I was struck in the flu letters written by survivors. There's hundreds of flu letters written by survivors from all over the world, and I was really struck though by how similar the letters were in terms of reporting on the symptoms and the psychological devastation of it.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, we have now several questions coming from the audience. One is, are there any conflicts or wars that threaten to erase the COVID experience? Will the history here repeat and we erase this for other forms of violence?
Oh, your audio went out, for me anyway.
Sorry, it went.
Yeah, no, I can't.
Right, all right. Now here, one question here is, yes, can you hear me?
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you?
Oh, well, let me answer the, I'll try to figure out that. But let me answer at least that first part of the question that I heard about, yeah, is there anything that will push COVID aside or any sort of?
Yeah, let me just quickly repeat. The question was, are there any conflicts or wars that threaten to erase the COVID experience?
See if maybe if I. Yes, he's cutting out. All right, let's see. Let me try taking out my headphones. All right. Can you still hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So the question was about what might interfere. Will history repeat itself? Will COVID be forgotten? Mm-hmm. So my best guess is no. I don't think it will be forgotten. For one thing, we have so many records of it. We're in this sort of overwhelming media environment, and I think that I don't think it will be. I don't think it will be forgotten. I do think it will be a little while before we can see the scope of it, before we can start seeing a lot of art coming out about the pandemic. Though some of it has already started. But nevertheless, I'm finding in certainly in the press in the United States right now. Obviously, the United States is in a political turmoil. And I do see that the political turmoil right now is front and center, right? And you really have to scroll down in your news in order to see that, we had 5 people killed or died at the Capitol, which is obviously very, very big news. But on the same day that I think it was over 4,000 people died of COVID. And I think that there is something about the way our minds work here, in that COVID is so hard to encompass, right? It's this invisible enemy. It feels somewhat abstract, right? And there's so little. I mean, we can do many things to prevent it, but it's really difficult to come to grips with. And I think people, just like we escape into movies or shows or TV or what have you, because we cannot deal with the amount of anxiety that COVID brings. I think sometimes stories, news stories that are easier to encompass and to make sense of, are sometimes get more attention because COVID is here and has been here for so long at this point. But my prediction is no, that COVID will not be forgotten. I hope, especially though, it won't be forgotten when we start to budget for pandemic preparation. We have the globe has a very bad habit of paying attention to pandemics only in the midst of acute crises and not remembering those crises when we go to determine budgets. And there's enormous amount of very, very productive things that we can do to prevent pandemics and to stop them in their tracks. And if we can devote resources to that, it will save many lives in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Now here another question, well, actually a couple of questions from the same person. Says, I'd be interested to hear about your thoughts on why a Sphinx, and also what are your comments on Lovecraftian proto-zombies?
Okay, those are two big questions. So I think that, the Sphinx is one of those images that is sort of overdetermined or multidimensional, right? It works in any number of different ways. And I think that in terms of the flu and in terms of the flu reading, it's a rich symbol in that it so often evokes, and I think Yeats was using it to evoke a kind of sense of an inscrutable quality, right? A sense of mystery, a sense of question, and not necessarily a sense of answer. So I think that that's part of it. I think that there's and I mean there's probably other things as well, but that's at least one thing that I think he's using it for. And I think that he does capture a kind of, in that the Sphinx is a hybrid sort of creature, this sort of sense of a non-human, the sense of a non-human violence, right? A non-human threat. In terms of zombies, yeah, how much time do you have? One of the things that I talk a lot about zombies in the book is zombies are another symbol that is multifaceted, right? I think every decade needs its own zombies. I think they're kind of a lurching signifier, and they mean different things at different times. And so in what I see in the zombies, the proto-zombies, the term zombie did not emerge in Anglophone literature until the publication of Seabrook's The Magic Island in 1929. But I look at sort of earlier 1920s figures of sort of zombie-like figures that are sort of the dead. They raise up and they rampage and they are hungry for human flesh. And these are all qualities that showed up in zombies in the 1920s and come from a sort of different kind of strain. And I think that the zombies I look at seem to arise from a kind of, I mean, one of the problems in 1919 was a body problem, right? You have between the war and the pandemic, you have 110 million corpses, right? That's just overwhelming to think about, right? And so you have all of this sense of the burial rituals in all across the world, not whatever the burial rituals were, not being followed. And no sense of closure and a sense of insecure burial. Right? And bodies often could not be buried because the worst came in some areas because of the cold. So so you have all of these bodies, right? And it seems to prey on the minds, right, of certain filmmakers and writers. And they kind of imagine this, imagine these zombies, often taking in a strangely comforting way, taking a threat that is invisible and turning it into a monster. And we often will do this with our monsters, right? Take something that is in our minds or things that we fear, and we make it into a visible threat. And that visible threat, the advantage is that you can then kill that visible threat, right? And then bury it, which is what happens in these stories. The other thing I see, though, I mean, zombies have a long sort of links to slavery, links to racism, and we see this in the 1920s zombies, in say H.P. Lovecraft's, some of H.P. Lovecraft's horror stories. H.P. Lovecraft is a horror writer. He's virulently racist, virulently homophobic, and so he takes the idea of infection, right, and all of these sort of terrible ideas he had about eugenics and the idea of Aryan blood being infected. And so he takes these medical metaphors and he applies them to sort of various races, to immigrants, to anyone he sort of felt were outside of the sort of cisgender, straight, male, white European norm. And he assigns those to these zombie figures who go sort of rampaging about. And I see a lot of sort of parallels between his stories and his zombies and some of the sort of Nazi rhetoric that came out later in World War II about how certain groups were infections, right, or cancers, and we see this a lot, right? We see this in COVID, the way medical metaphors or medical terms like infection and contagion get applied to certain groups or certain countries or certain areas. And those are all linked to zombies. So that's the short answer of the zombie question.
Right, thank you very much. Another one is comparing the literary response to the 1918-1919 influenza and to the current pandemic. It seems noteworthy that the literary genre used for responses has changed, namely to speculative and dystopian fiction. Utopian hope is very often driven by female characters and post-anthropocentric cooperation, very different from modernist literature. I was wondering whether you could comment on that.
I mean, I think it's a great comment in and of itself, that I do see that happening here. I think it's too early to know exactly how COVID will filter down into art and literature, in that it is often there's often a lag time. It takes us a while to process trauma and to turn it into art. And so it's going to be interesting for us all, I think, to see in 5, 10, 20 years sort of how COVID gets filtered down through the art. But I think that this, and I guess one of the things that I would hope is that some of the speculative fiction, some of the, often, yes, with female protagonists, and also a kind of reimagining of environmental threats, and sort of I think one of the things that the literature that comes out of this might do is to help us see this as a network of things, right? That we know that environmental degradation is leading directly to new viruses emerging, right? So the kind of the pandemic of environmental violence cannot be separated from the pandemic of viral violence, nor can it really be separated from the pandemic of racism or discrimination, right? Or inequalities, economic inequalities. The way these things are synergistic, right, and are working together. And what I hope is not only do we get fiction, and we already have much fiction, right, that shows us that, but that shows us how these things are working together. But I think that we also will desperately need, and again, we already have some of this, but desperately need visions of utopian futures, right? Visions of how do we, and this is kind of built into the kind of frame of this conference, how do we not simply imagine disaster, but how do we imagine a better way forward, right? How do we imagine this not turning out this way? Because we could make that happen. We really could. And I think that we need to devote a lot of imaginative energy to figuring out what that might look like.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I mean, this also kind of addresses some of the other questions. Well, the next one here starts with a remark, wonderful reinterpretation of Yeats's poem. And the question is, people historically seem to have a very short memory. Please discuss the present day denial to take precautions such as wearing masks. Also, please discuss issue of diminishing consumerism being pitted against acceptance of the reality of the devastation of COVID-19.
So
yeah, the masks, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think that I think we have to think a lot about both forgetting and denial. And I think that this goes back to some of the features of a viral threat. Viral threats are invisible. There are lag times. We know that this is a contagious virus, but we can't necessarily trace exactly where, I mean, we try, exactly where somebody gets infected, right? We can sometimes have good guesses, right? But sometimes it's a mystery. I've often thought that if smoking, which we all know is terrible for you, but so many of us smoke or used to smoke. But if all smoking did was every time you had a cigarette, it created a huge boil in the middle of your forehead. And that's it. It didn't hurt your lungs, didn't hurt anything, right? But it just created this huge red sort of terrible boil in the middle of your forehead. No one would smoke, right? Because the result would be immediate. And I think that one of the things is that there is this lag time with the virus. And our day-to-day experience, if we are able to stay home, if we're lucky enough where we're able to stay home, there is it seems like things are not normal, but it doesn't seem like that dangerous, right? If the virus was visible in the streets, right, nobody would go out. So some of it is this invisibility. Some of it is a natural trauma response of the body. Anyone who's ever lost someone knows that one of the first things that happens is a kind of denial, right? That you cannot accept this new reality. I think one of the difficult things about a pandemic is how it changes our paradigms almost overnight. If you can cast your mind back to what it was like in March, and things that were unthinkable the day before suddenly came into being the next day, right? So there is this sort of jarring sense of your reality changing faster than you can incorporate it, and a desire to forget. We try to forget actively the worst things that have happened to us. And we don't currently have a lot of our sort of ways of processing grief in place. So I think that there's a huge reckoning to come in that we're going to need, I think, at least a decade to process the kind of grief and loss that we're experiencing right now. And art has always played essential role, and the humanities as well, right? Any society that can't figure out how to help its people recover from extreme loss is going to break apart, and we're going to need art desperately in order to process this kind of loss. And I think we're going to have to face it and push against our desire to forget or push it aside. But I mean, I've spent the better part of 5 years studying pandemics, and still I have to stop myself from reading the news. And obsessively, right? It's a lot to take in, and we're gonna need some time to do it. The diminishing consumerism, I hope it continues. I really do. I think that the best thing that the pandemic could do is to help us focus right on the things that actually matter and what we actually need. And this gets back to the sort of new vision thing, but to pull on what this conference is trying to do, right? It's one world ends and another world emerges, and we have to think about what that world that is going to emerge is going to be, right? We don't want to go back, in fact, to normal. We want something better, right? Something different, something more, something healthier, and certainly that would involve less consumerism, which incidentally would result in less viruses.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Now, another question is, if, as you demonstrate so brilliantly, we can reinterpret texts previously seen as dealing with World War, what are the implications for pandemic studies? Do you welcome a mass revisionist project, particularly concerning high modernist texts, utilizing our new insights?
I do. I think it would be good for criticism. I think it would be good for us. I think it would be good for our minds. I mean, I was only able to look at a handful of works because, limits of pages and expertise. But I think that we could. I was so struck that the works that I discuss are works that I have taught for years, right? Over a decade, and simply not seen through this lens, right? I did not process that Mrs. Dalloway in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway was recovering from influenza, right? I read over that, right? And so I think that there's so many texts that I didn't discuss, so many things that I'm not seeing, right? And so and so many different sort of cultures, countries, areas, languages, right? That might be reconsidered through this pandemic lens, and I'm really hoping that will happen, because I think that it will train us or help train us to get out of the habit of discounting illness, right? And discounting pandemics and discounting our kind of violence that happens internally through this invisible enemy, and bring that into our studies, and even as a mental exercise to start seeing for things that we don't normally see. Also helps with other systemic problems, right? All of the ways that a kind of systemic racism infuses so much literature, a kind of the sort of systemic qualities of environmental degradation, right? Things that are in plain sight, but that we are not seeing. So I think training ourselves to see through different lenses and paradigms for the gaps, for the silences, for the things that we know that our perceptions are shaped by what we expect to find. And so we need to expand what we expect to find. So certainly for pandemic studies, I think that there's a big reevaluation that can happen. And again, for a lot of other things that we do.
Okay, thank you very much. Some kind of related to this, it says one thing that came up during your talk was the importance of interwar literature, but also the resonance it had with war and post-traumatic stress. This was particularly clear in what you mentioned about the uniformity of infection, yet the inequalities that a pandemic makes explicit, which to me seems very true of wartime. In that light, in the Anglophone West, what do you make of the use of militaristic or nationalistic rhetoric of responses to COVID-19?
Yes, okay. Yes, the part of the challenge for me of this project was sort of seeing the entanglement of the war and the pandemic, all of the ways they intersected, in terms of representation and bodies, and the ways that they literally intersected in it, sort of the fueling infections and affecting battles. And then sorting that out too, though, from the distinctions between these two forms of mass death. All right, so I was constantly trying to kind of both see the connections and then see the distinctions. In terms of the militaristic, the kind of the militaristic terms, I think that in some ways, one of the things that I think people are trying to do by using militaristic terms is to get people to take it seriously, right? And people seem to take human-based violence seriously, much more so than a kind of bodily violence, like a viral violence. And there's a whole range of reasons for that, probably linked to gender. But I think that those military metaphors are ways of signaling to people, oh, this is really important and you should take it seriously. However, there's a lot of danger in using military metaphors for viruses, because we can assume things about viruses are not armies. They are not sort of enemies in the same way. The viruses do bad things often, but that kind of rhetoric can also have its downsides, because it can distort the way we approach prevention. It can distort the way we approach a virus, and it can really easily then switch into sort of racist or xenophobic attacks on sort of whole groups or whole countries, right? That we search for, we think, oh, this is an enemy. We want an externalized enemy, and so scapegoating starts. And so I think that we need to be very, very aware of what we're doing when we start using those sorts of militarized metaphors. In fact, there was one sort of study that suggested in terms of cancer research, one of the new sort of directions is to not think of cancer as an enemy, but to think of it as sort of, how do we live with it, right? How do we cooperate with it and have it sort of exist in the body without it hurting the body, right? And that kind of paradigm shift required a change in the metaphors that we use. That's just one example.
Okay, thanks. Professor Ruth Levitas has a question. She says, I'm wondering about the impact of the flu pandemic on political discourse, and especially the appeal of anti-Semitic rhetoric in Germany in the afterwar, in the interwar period. Excuse me.
So I think that this is a big question, and I think that that there's all sorts of ways, large and small, right? That the flu infiltrated political decisions, the outcomes of battles, and decisions made by lawmakers. I absolutely see this kind of lingering fear of the flu infiltrating the sort of Nazis co-opting that kind of language of disease. I mean, we have that even before the flu, right? So, you know, influence is difficult to trace. Something that made the book difficult is to because there's never a kind of one-to-one course like that. The flu led directly to this, but you can see influence, right? And so you can trace lines of influence. And I absolutely think that this sort of fear of a kind of airborne contagion was everywhere, and it allowed minds to kind of latch onto that and think, you know, in the ways that the Nazis did about whole sort of groups being a threat. But one of the things that's true also about the flu, just most directly that links World War I and World War II and the flu, is that Woodrow Wilson is fighting very, very hard for less severe reparations for Germany at Versailles, and he gets the flu, right? He gets the strain of the flu in the middle of these negotiations. And he's so ill, he ends up capitulating to the demands of the French, and these very, very harsh reparations go in for Germany. And then it sort of seeds the way, potentially. I mean, a lot of historians would tell you that the Treaty of Versailles, sort of, you can trace a path between these very harsh reparations to World War II. So there's all sorts of political calculations that go into the flu in all these like thousands of different ways. There's a lot of impact in the flu. Some historians have talked about the flu's link to India and partition. And so its impacts are everywhere, and certainly there's political impacts at every level. Oh dear. Okay, so I can't hear you again. I don't know.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Professor Outka. Looks like there's more than one question regarding like a gendered understanding of the pandemics or gendered responses to the pandemic. Like one of them is one of our audience is expecting you, if possible, to elaborate on as the pandemic spread across many countries, how did the different cultural definitions of femininity / masculinity influence the understandings of the flu-related deaths?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Another big one, but I'll answer with a few with a sort of just a few observations that won't cover everything. So one of the things that you see happening is that there's all of these corpses, right? But it matters how corpses become corpses. And there's a widespread perception before the flu, and I think it's really in some ways still with us, that the disease is coded, and I'm not agreeing with this, right? But that disease is often coded feminine, right? A kind of weakness of the body. There's speculation that more men are dying of COVID, not simply for some kind of underlying biological reason, but because they don't, that many men feel like they won't succumb, right, to this virus, right, because they're too strong. And so the way that disease got coded as feminine, and war death coded as masculine. And then there's a different sacrificial structure, of course, as well. Right? You can disagree with the war, you can debate about it, but deaths in war are often viewed and dealt with by talking about sacrifice, right? That this is a meaningful sacrifice, that this death prevents 100 other deaths. You can't do that with the flu, right? You can't, right? Like a flu death meant your family was more likely to die of the flu, right? Not less, right? So that sacrificial structure doesn't work. So that there is a way that people were in many ways longing, they wanted to die, and if they were going to die, they wanted to die in the war, not of the flu. So you have all sorts of people saying, oh, what a shame he died of the flu, right? And not in the war. But then there's also this really interesting thing that emerges, again, in sort of across the globe, this sense that maybe this was fate's way of balancing out the death toll of young men in the war, because suddenly in 1918, 1919, women are dying in equal numbers. There were places where men died more of the flu than women, other places where women died more of the flu than men, more or less it was equal. But suddenly, right, all these young women are dying. And again, the healthier you were, the more likely you were to die of this flu. So it really scrambled people's perceptions, and there was this sort of scramble to think, well, maybe this is the fates or gods or whatever it is you believed in was a way of balancing out all of these deaths. Some people felt it was a punishment, right? A punishment for the war. There was all sorts of explanations of this, but they sometimes ran along gendered lines. But it was widely perceived that a death in the flu was a capitulation, right? You succumbed to the flu, that there was something unmasculine about dying of the flu. Robert Frost says, like, you know, I came through the war, I wasn't going to die of the flu. And so there is this perception that there was a kind of weakness, around that. It also introduced, you know, difficulties for writers. So women were expected to write about sort of disease, but yeah, like Willa Cather is like, no, right? I mean, she does write about disease, but she surrounds it with war. She even changes the dates of the influenza pandemic, so the war continues on, right? Once the pandemic is done. So and she wanted no part, right, of that. She wanted to write about the war. Hemingway had a lot of experiences, actually direct experiences with influenza, and it does creep into some of his short stories. But there is a sense that, you know, that this was a much worse way to die, right, than a death in battle. So there's all sorts of gendered things that are going on with the flu, and still with COVID.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe this one last question, since we're talking about the pandemics in terms of battles and warfare, and there are these other people who are always on the front lines. So this question will be about them as well. So this begins in terms of the rough beasts Yeats mentions, and with Jade Martin's question about the representation of bodies and their dissolution. I have a couple of questions. One, what genre of story do you think that the US is in? This is followed by, is the condition of uncertainty one of the rough beasts that the pandemic is giving rise to? And the last one, maybe you can combine all of this. How do you think this uncertainty relates to the bodies of people working during the pandemic? It seems like key essential workers are expected to live in a state of invisibility or between different forms of dissolution.
Yes. Okay. There's again. These are great questions. Thank you so much for them. That's another one that has a lot of angles that I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of them. But I think that I'm not sure what genre the U.S. is in. You know, horror for sure. I guess denial. Whistling in the dark, something along those lines. I think uncertainty is a primary beast, and I think that it's one of the things that makes this so very, very difficult. That we don't know where we are in the story, and I think it's why a lot of us are reaching for stories, genre fiction, right, where we know where we are in the story, we know what's going to happen. Because we hate uncertainty, or at least most of us do, and we find it very difficult to cope with. And I think that it's not just something we have to get around, right? I think that uncertainty is one of our central beasts right now. How do we cope minute by minute and day by day with the fact that we don't know what's going to happen? We don't know what will happen tomorrow. And I think, again, literature can help us process that, but it can also help us process, and this is one of the reasons I love something like the Second Coming, it also can represent how difficult it is, right? So it's not that the Second Coming gives us certainty, but it represents the difficulty of that uncertainty, right? The unmoored quality where you don't know what's happening. And so I think that's something that very valuable that literature can do is not solve our questions, right, or answer our questions, but to represent this kind of uncertainty. I think that the way that the essential workers are sort of alternatively revered, which is in some ways it's good, in some ways it's a way of making them disappear as well, or implying that their work is voluntary. And I also think that it very much links to this avoidance, this sort of sense that somebody out there will bring us our food, or will bring us that they, that's just what doctors sign up for, right? Or nurses sign up for, or what teachers sign up for, or what grocery store workers sign up for. It's manifestly not what they sign up for. But this sort of denial of all of the people who are on, who are at extraordinary high risk, right? And who are doing it for economic, right, for economic necessity reasons, and certainly also for altruistic reasons. Some, who have the choice doing it for altruistic reasons, right? And I do think that 100% that they should be getting those vaccines, right? Those first lines of vaccines. But I do think that all of these things are related to each other in terms of the kind of dissipation or the dispersal of the body, right? And this links us back to loss and grief, right? And the way that the kind of vertigo of grief, anyone who's ever lost somebody close to them knows that kind of pandemic paradigm shifting vertigo that can ensue, right? This sort of panic of uncertainty that you will never see this person again, right? That their body has dissolved, right? That there's, and that kind of, the mind sort of just, it's very hard for the mind to encompass that kind of loss and that kind of grief. And I think that this is what so much of our literature is trying to do and trying to help us with. And to kind of to try to rebuild that person in some other form of representation. I do think this links to the resurgence of seances after the pandemic in World War I. This hunger where you have the Sorbonne studying seriously ectoplasm, which is supposed to be that kind of connective tissue between the next world and this, like trying to figure out how do we see things that we can no longer see, bodies that have dissipated, and I think that's part of the work that we have ahead of us, right? How do we start to encompass these sorts of numbers? How do we cope with the loss and grief that we have experienced in the last year? How do we protect essential workers? How do we envision a more equitable world?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I actually have this one last question, and I said the previous one was the last one, but this one is something that we can all relate to right now. Maybe in the remaining minute, if you could please address that. Professor Philip Wagner's question. I'm wondering about the way the current pandemic is being deployed as an excuse to advance various agendas. For example, my university and many others in the US are using the pandemic as an excuse to engage in a dramatic and disturbing reorganization of the university. Were there similar such consequences in the 1918 pandemic? And what are some lessons we might learn from them for the present is my last question, Professor Outka. Thank you very much.
Yes, so in terms of the reorganization of the university in the 1918 pandemic, or the reorganization of society, there was some. The influenza pandemic was different in that it did stretch over this 2-year period, but this acute phase, right? This acute phase was really this sort of 4-month phase, right? Which is different and does shift things. There was a real reorganization of medical research and reporting of illness, and that's another sort of outside of my field, but a huge topic. But I am also seeing this in the United States in terms of this sort of excuse to using the pandemic as an excuse for really pernicious reorganizations, right? If you want to sort of organize something like a health department to make it better, function better, that's one thing, right? But this reorganization, and that, as we know, often impacts the humanities. And at the moment when the humanities could not be more important, right? Where so many of the things that we are experiencing that are terrible are things that the humanities is uniquely suited to address and even to solve. We are consolidating departments, cutting them, and cutting off some of the very, very best avenues that we have to address and to encompass what is happening in this pandemic. So I think it is a tragedy, and I think that part of why it's happening is that people are exhausted, and it is the energy to just get through your day is quite more than many of us have, and to go into a huge fight. It's just exhausting, and I do think that administrations are using that as an excuse to make changes, and I hope we can fight it, and I hope we can push back, because this pandemic demonstrates the importance of the humanities like very few things have.
All right, Professor Outka, thank you so very much for this illuminating lecture and for addressing all of these, pretty much all of the questions. Now we go on a meal break for about an hour, but as Nora has also put in the chat box there, in about 10 minutes, the concert will also start. And we'll meet again in about, again, an hour at 8:30 Turkish time for Kim Stanley Robinson's talk.
Hocam, thank you. I think for the concert, we have a unique link. So we wait everyone during for the concert. I think it's going to be a great performance. Our musicians from Netherlands prepared a wonderful performance for you. And I have attached the concert program also in the chat box. So it will start in 11 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Outka. It's been a pleasure having you.